Hi guys. Okay, so that is time. Everybody is here. Cool. So, hi everybody. Welcome to the quarterfinal of the opening government.
Tin speaking first. Here they please.
Okay.
Miri speaking second. Here they please.
Cool. Opening up.
Samek speaking first. Here.
Okay.
Thanks.
Maurice second.
Cool. Closing up. Closing up.
Sahas speaking first. No preference.
Yash speaking second, no preference.
Awesome. And closing up.
Marius first, Samuel second. Here they is fine for both.
Awesome. And my name is Nicole, by the way, and I'll be your chair. You can just address the panel as a whole, introducing my panelists as well. Anybody? Okay.
No panelist ever knows whether to go first. I'm Elijah.
Okay. Cool.
I am Joseph.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, cool. So without further ado, if there are no questions or anything else, I'd like to call upon the Prime Minister to open the case for their side. Q here.
Okay. Do you hear me? Let me just take my stopwatch. Okay. 1, 2, 3. The way this world works is that God knows your fate, and your fate is predetermined regardless of what you do. However, you do not know what your fate is going to be. An example of that kind of religion is Protestantism, just to make clear what we're talking about. A converse example is Catholicism, where the center is the presupposed free will of its adherents. We think it's a far preferable world, and we're going to bring many points to you about it. The first thing we want to talk about is how religion limits agency already in the status quo, and how therefore the side of the opposition creates an intense emotional burden when making important life decisions. There's a couple of things you need to understand about religion. First of all, it's incredibly hard to escape its grip. Most often, you're born into it and you're taught that religion is inculcated in you by figures of authority you do not have the mental capacity to question at a younger point in life. Secondly, even if you try to question it further down the line, you're very likely to meet social disapprobation by your friends, by your peers, which is something which is a social sanction on you, and you are likely to fear. Very often you can even be disavowed by your family. Note in most Abrahamic religions, apostasy, i.e. the act of knowing the path to enlightenment and abandoning it, is a worse sin than not believing in the first place. But thirdly, even if you do decide to leave a religion, there is always the shred of doubt about whether you made the right decision and whether you've damned yourself for all eternity. This becomes more important when you know that it's an eternal reward and punishment mechanism. So every decision that you do is under the lens of the deity, and the deity is using this to discern whether you deserve hell or you deserve heaven. This means that within every important decision an individual makes in life, every decision related to morals in any way, this extremely weighs on them, which limits the capacity of individuals to make decisions because it's an existential fear, right? People adhering to religion believe that the afterlife is more important than this life. Every decision is compared to the set of morals and to the punishment, and it's weighing in. It's a feeling of doubt, not just whether you've damned yourself, but whether you are now a moral person in the face of God, who's your primary authority for morals. We say to the extent to which these decisions happen anyway, it weighs in on individuals horribly. The comparative is an opposition. They are never free, right? Because there is a set moral code. There is a set list of rewards and punishments which you cannot escape. So you always have to act within the boundaries of those codes. The comparative is that on their side, because you know every action influences your fate in the afterlife, you're likely to compare your actions to this moral code and always question whether you made the right decisions. You're more likely not to make decisions at all, or after you made them, question them, dwell on them, and have huge emotional impacts from this. On our side, you are more free because the same thought processes happen, right? You still calculate earthly harms and benefits to yourself, but you know that you cannot in any way impact the afterlife, so you are more free to actually assess the information that you have based on how this will impact you in the earthly life. But also there's a mechanism of optimism bias, right? Because in a world where your fate is predetermined, there is still a divine scheme. Every religion interprets the divine plan as being positive, right? As being a linear path to salvation. So whatever is happening in the status quo and whatever decision you make probably supposed to lead to some kind of enlightenment down the line, even if you make a wrong decision, right? So it's more easy to rationalize that. Individuals are not free on both sides of the house, but we would like that within an agency limiting system, they can at least make decisions more freely. But secondly, we say this applies even more to individuals who find themselves under heavy circumstances, right? Things such as poverty and dire straits and stuff like this. In an action-based system, especially when your religion is your primary source of morals, your God is something you look to for proof that you are acting well. And when it's an action-based system, you see this proof in your material circumstances of existence. So if you find yourself in a bad situation, you're more likely to internalize the fact that this is your fault and God is punishing you. But the fact is that very often you do not know how to get out of the situation, or you physically cannot, right? Because the government screwed you over, because you're being discriminated, right? So you're forcing people to internalize a situation which is already horrible as their fault. Why is this important? Because especially when you find yourself in heavy material circumstances, the only thing you can cling on for quality of life is your mental health in particular. You maintaining control of the situation through maintaining a positive image of yourself and believing that you can do right and you can pull out of it. This is contingent on you believing that you have the right course of action. You're more likely to believe this on our side of the house because on our side of the house it all makes sense. Note my analysis on the divine scheme. The reason why you find yourselves here is because God has predetermined a specific path you must walk down. These are the trials through which you may find moral satisfaction, right? Suffering is virtuous, and through this suffering, enlightenment will necessarily come because God cares. And if you are a believer, you believe that you are on the right side of the heaven and hell dichotomy. So you believe that the path that God has preordained for you is necessarily good, right? And this is the optimism bias mechanism. But thirdly, moral agency. We say this limits the capacity of religious institutions to manipulate people's actions. Note that very often they do this about many decisions, including important ones like who to vote for, which is essentially your only mechanism to control the state that controls your life, or which people to respect, which nationalities or ethnic minorities to interact with, which severely limits your capacity to create your own moral code and follow your own conception of the good, because even if you may intuitively disagree, which is then probably something you do not want to follow because something else might make you happy, you still cannot move away from this, right? Because it was told to you by someone who can claim to interpret the word of God. And if the word of God is open-end, like you do not know what is going to happen, you only have guidelines from God, then the people who offer you the interpretation of God are those who are supposed to guide you through this path, which means that they have far more power to influence the decisions that you're going to make. I'll take you later, closing opposition. On our side of the house, this becomes no longer true, because whatever happens, everyone's fate is already predetermined, and God is not going to decide based on the earthly decisions that you make, which means that you're on the general level more free to act and make important decisions regarding controlling the state, regarding politics and stuff like this, because at the end of the day, you believe that justice is going to come out correctly. And secondly, you have less third-party influence on your morals, which we believe it's a benefit in and of itself, because the definition of happiness is being able to create your own conception of the good and at least striving to achieve and become a person who adheres to that conception. That ability is far limited on opposition. Before I move on, Theo seems to have a clarification or something.
Okay, so the motion specifically says that my fate in the material world is determined. So surely God determines how rich I get, but whether I get into heaven is still a matter of my personal choices and ethics, right?
Yes, but this helps our side as well. Because if your material fate is predetermined, then this means that to a large and significant extent, this is not your fault. But secondly, if your fate in the material world is predetermined, you also do not believe that your fate in the material world is a punishment. If you do not believe that, the decision-making mechanisms also stand. Fourthly, we can say, and this also impacts identities and stuff like this. Because if you are born, for example, as an LGBTQ person, this is an identity, right? Which means, and this is a fate in the material world, because you were born into the material world as such. Then therefore, this was also God's scheme. And if that identity was preordained by God, then therefore it is also natural, which means we can weaponize this against the narratives pushed very often by religious authorities. But lastly, political empowerment also exists. Because if you believe that fate in the material world is predetermined, you also believe that the just outcome is going to be the one that wins. Therefore, you're more likely to undertake political action, which may be risky for you, but necessary for freedom, like strikes and like protests, because you believe that God has already ordained that justice is going to win in the material world, which means people are more likely to take recourse over their action, over their situation. This is the reason why they followed MLK at the end of the day. For all these reasons and all these benefits, opening government wins the debate.
I would like to thank the speaker for the fine speech and call upon the leader of the opposition. Hear.
Okay, cool. Am I audible? Wonderful. Panel, I think that the biggest failure of the opening government is that they give you one mechanism, which is basically less questioning of the circumstances in which you find yourself, but they do not really characterize the groups that can use this coping mechanism, that they can actually, basically indulge in not questioning yourself. And we think that this is where the whole crux of the case lies, because oftentimes what is problematic is that this non-questioning is going to be used by homophobes, with people that believe that it is part of their identity to actually question whether someone has the right to live, by authorities that are going to manipulate you, and so on and so forth. So first of all, I'm going to very briefly address that problem of the open government case. Then I'm going to quickly talk about why adhering to a religion makes you less complicit with the current world, or makes the whole situation that is very hard to change much more bearable. And then I'm going to talk about people that are successful that cannot feel why their agency matters, which we think is actually very horrible for them. In regards to rebuttal, 2 points very quickly. So we want to posit that the fact that everything makes sense is making you act compliant in many sort of situations. Because that, if you don't question the circumstances of your existence, if you think that everything is a God's plan, if you think that it has been ordered by God, probably you are actually much more likely to believe the authorities of your church, for instance, because it is these authorities that have been actually explaining to you throughout all your life how God looks like, what is the sort of salvation that you want to achieve, and so on and so forth. So all of the mechanisms that Tin outlined at the beginning of his speech actually makes the manipulation on their side of the house for religious authorities much easier, because you are less likely to question the position in which you find yourself. And whatever you do, whatever you feel, you might feel it's very not right, it's very not correct, it's something that is not right. You might feel that you are causing harm to other people, yet you are still probably going to follow the religious authorities in many cases. You are going to be manipulated by them and believe the sort of brainwashing they do to you, because you cannot really question why you are in the situation like this, because you just believe it's a God's plan. The same goes with the example that he mentioned at the very end of his speech. So yeah, probably people that are born homosexuals believe that it has been ordered by God, but it also works the other way around. People that are homophobes that believe that it is something that is not right, it is something that they have the right to oppose. So probably it's a wash on both sides of the house, and the situation of people that are extremely oppressed doesn't change much, because there is a number of other factors that actually influence that. Going to the case, adhering to a religion that is deterministic serves as a better coping mechanism for people that are unsatisfied with their lives. And before I go into that case, I just want to posit, it is not necessarily about people that are oppressed or discriminated, but rather about people that at many situations in their lives think that they are unsatisfied with their lives, which is a vast majority of the society that is actually questioning how they might feel. And this is also how we should look into this debate, because that is probably a debate that happens from behind a veil of ignorance, and we cannot really say who is that individual in question. So the first point is that on their side of the house, at the very best, if you are in a super bad position where you have no hope whatsoever, life is easier. You accept it is not your fault. In most situations, however, people have desires to change something about the situation. Even in, like the most deterministic societies, people believe that they should do something about their lives because their life is just unbearable. So the benefit of OG, in our opinion, is that in most situations, the religion is not going to really give you, this sort of solace. It is not really going to give you this sort of hope that you have when you are living in poverty. You are not going to feel, oh, okay, maybe that's God's plan. Maybe, my life has some meaning, and so on and so forth. Because in most cases, people are still going to feel that there's something not right about this, and they're going to do something about this life. The comparative, however, is that the vast majority of people, it is easier to accept why they're oppressed, why they're unsatisfied with their lives, why their lives are unbearable. If there is a reason to this, because this reason does not have to be with them. That reason does not necessarily have to lie with their fault. They think it is the system. They actually start understanding why they're facing this injustice. They question that. We believe that it is very good that lots of Afro-Americans are believing in deterministic religions, because that makes them question, okay, there has to be a reason as to why I'm in this place. Probably I haven't done anything wrong. This is not a God's punishment. This is actually life's punishment. This is the system's punishment. And that makes, obviously, the whole existence for them much easier, because they understand why they are being oppressed. They understand where this oppression is coming from, and they're not becoming just complacent with the system. Second of all, it is important to feel that you have actually chosen your path to some extent. Lots of people in extremely bad position find a lot of help in feeling that they are special, in feeling that they endure some suffering because they have chosen to. Mother Teresa and a lot of poor people that have been inspired by her all around the world were actually that very case. They have not said that they have been ordained by God to live in poverty. They have said, it is my choice. I believe that this is a good thing to do, and therefore the whole suffering that I endure is much better. In most cases, people do not like to accept that they're living in poverty just because something happened. Even if it's God's plan, it's very hard for them to accept it. What really gives them this hope, what really makes their lives much more bearable, is that basically you can understand this as a part that you have chosen, as a path that you have chosen. What are the impacts of this? First of all, that this serves as a motivator to fight and change something about your lives. Because note, panel, that probably the only one moment when you can actually change your life is when you have a very clear goal, when you can actually identify, this is the system that I want to fight, this is something that I want to change in our life. Even if you feel that something is not right about the system on their side of the house, it's probably much harder for you to make this very brave and courageous step of, I don't know, rebelling against the government, or saying that, I have to do something about my life, because you don't really, you still question whether, maybe this is a God's plan, maybe this is something that is that I'm supposed to, maybe this is the life that I'm supposed to live. Second of all, this agency means that a lot of people can actually find sense, because note, panel, that suffering is something that we endure every day, and it makes sense to a lot of us if we at least can understand it is in the prism of our agency, that we have chosen that we have made a trade-off. This is the only reason as to why we can actually have lives satisfactory. The last thing that I want to very briefly mention is that we don't think it's actually fair towards lots of these people that are extremely successful that they cannot own their success, because oftentimes they are being questioned, specifically religious people. There is a stigma on people that are extremely successful in religious communities, because it is being said, oh, it is not really hard work, it's God's plan, you are not really, owning that. And in many cases, that means that these people cannot really feel the happiness that they should be deriving from the material world, and we think that they have the right to do that. Thanks.
Great. I'd like to thank that speaker for the fine speech and call upon the DPN. Hear, hear.
Two points of rebuttal in my speech, and then I will look at what makes the world a better place. And I think, first, if individuals are generally happier and have a better life, and second, if the collective effects of actions undertaken lead to more good rather than less bad. Spoiler alert, both of those will be on our side, right? Before that, first point of rebuttal. So first, the idea that OO gives us in terms of not questioning homophobes. Please notice that regardless of whether everything you do is predetermined or not, there is still heaven or hell at the end, right? It might still be a matter of ethics what you think is heaven or hell, but there is no evidence in the material world that you are being punished for something, right? You can't look around for proof or disproof that you are or aren't doing the right or wrong thing, right? And that means that it makes the decision process easier, because you only have to look at your internal moral compass and what you think is right or wrong. And also the idea of authorities in church that manipulate you easier. I don't think that's true. I think it's much easier to manipulate it if you think you are in a bad place or have done something bad. You don't really know what it is that you've done something bad, but you know it must be because you didn't listen to your priest or to your community. So you go to them for answers, and you are much more likely to follow whatever they tell you, because you think that whatever happens right now is a direct result and a direct consequence of what you have done. One very important bit of framing. Please notice that even on government side, yes, we do believe that most things that happen to you in the material world are predetermined, but they're probably predetermined in the large sense of, are you going to succeed in life or not? Are you born in these conditions or not? Is God watching over you? Does God want you to do this, or does God not want you to do this? Notice that I'm using the verb do this, right? That probably means that lives in a predetermined universe doesn't mean you just sit on your ass all day and you wait for God to give you things and to give you signs, right? It still means that you have to go out there. It still means that you want to earn pay and feed your family. It still means you go and try to achieve things. You still have goals. You still want to feel enjoyment. You are still going to be doing things. The difference is that it's easier to pull through dire straits and not internalize guilt when those things go wrong, right? And the second point of rebuttal on the idea of questioning the system. Please notice that if you are being oppressed, you are unlikely to suddenly think this is a good thing, or this feels good, or this is right. You're still going to think this is the wrong thing to do, and you're probably still going to think that oppression is wrong. What does that mean? It means that you think your moral imperative, aka the right thing to do for you, would be to fight against it. That incentive doesn't go away. Two things change. One, when you fail, you no longer think this is your fault, and you don't fall into the learned helplessness of I have tried, I have failed. Many people before me, better than me and smarter than me, have tried and failed, and thus this can't be done. You are more likely to accept that, yes, God is still with me. It wasn't meant to be this time, but I will try again, and maybe it will be better this time and next time. It makes it easier to overcome setbacks. And on the idea of feeling special and chosen because you endure suffering because you can, like, you're still chosen by God, right? There's this expression that God doesn't give you more than you can carry. So if God gives you a lot of bullshit, it probably means you're a strong person who can take it. You do still feel special. Okay, let's look at what makes individuals generally happier. And I think that most of the things that Tin has told you are largely ignored, and I think they still stand. Please check your notes on that panel. Especially three ideas. First, the idea that you are likely to think that whatever setbacks and hurdles are in your life, or whatever bad conditions you were born into, are part of your straight line to salvation, rather than something you must have brought upon you for something that you don't really know what it is, but you must have done something. Secondly, on the idea that you can't own your success, that opening opposition pros at us, I think you still enjoy success, and it's still God that chose you to have success. It's still God that loves you and gave it to you. So I don't think that necessarily goes away on side of opposition. It might change, but you overall still get to feel just as good about yourself. And thirdly, please notice that a large proportion of the population is not doing great at any given time, and that is something that is not in their control, right? First, people born in Africa, or people born even in developed countries in absolute poverty, who have very little access to opportunities and education. People who are born as minorities who are being oppressed. I don't think the strive to do better and to feel better in your life is going to go away. The only thing that changes, as I've already told you in my rebuttal, is how do you go about it, right? And just to add one more thing to it, why I don't think it will lead to complacency and to you giving up and thinking that's the way it's supposed to be. One, because as I've mentioned, you still have to do things, right? God just doesn't throw you at you. But second, because assuming you're trying to fight injustice, or you're trying to protest, right? You're probably, especially as part of a minority, or as a woman, or as an LGBT person, you're probably going to look at it and realize that there are many hurdles in front of you, and that is something that is very, very hard to do. I think your success chances being very low are much more likely to scare you off if you think everything that happens is a direct consequence of you doing, versus if you think that God has a plan and that God is watching over you, you are probably more emboldened to try. And once you have failed, you are less likely to think it can't be done and more likely to try again. Closing, I will take you now.
Okay, if you need to believe that the current state of the world, including oppression and poverty, is according to God's will, which the info slide says, then why would you want to change it?
Because you do know that God loves everyone. You do know that God wants everyone to live happily. And because you've probably read the Bible and seen that there's a lot of bad things happening because there are a lot of bad people out there. And then there is a mandate from God for other people to stop them, for other people to maybe suffer in the process and sacrifice themselves, because that's like a big part of the Bible, that you become a martyr in sacrificing yourself to trying to free the poor or the weak or the something, right? So I think that is something that empowers you to act for justice, especially when you think that you know what justice is. I don't think that it's very plausible to assume that people who are born as homophobes will now assume it is their mandate to get rid of homosexuals, because I think it is a much stronger mandate in the Bible to be nice to everyone else, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And it's also a very strong mandate, especially on side government, that at the end, God won't put everyone there. God will take care of them at the end, meaning that you don't necessarily think it is upon you to punish people directly for their choice of being gay or something. You're more likely to accept them as God wanted them to be gay, or God wanted them to be a minority. And they are more likely to be seen as something that is your test. Not only that, but I think the rich and privileged are less likely to be emboldened to do bad things and oppress people on side government. I'm very proud to propose.
Great. I'd like to thank that speaker for a fine speech and call upon the DLO. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Madam Chair, panel, right at the end of this speech, there was a very small hidden gem, which is to say that the people that actually believe in the types of religion that God wants to are not homophobes. There are not individuals who are Protestants and homophobes at the same time, based on their logic. There are no manipulative businessmen who are actually Protestants at the same. Are all things that they actually have been given by God. They're all things that they've been given by God and that they are okay because, well, God put me into that position. And as a result, I have this moral imperative to uphold those opinions if I want to make it to salvation. I actually think that there's a very small, there's quite a big problem in their case, which can be summarized as follows. They have the same actor giving different fates to different individuals, right? God gives some people success, God gives some people failure. But in their efforts to win this debate, I think they've created this very asymmetrical and, in fact, I think very unrealistic portrayal of how people internalize those things. Because if God gives you success, right, as we said, and if Miri is correct and the people feel that they deserve that success because God gave it to them, and as a result they can extract enjoyment out of it, then surely if God has given you failure, then God believes that you should be given failure, and that in fact, this is the way to make it to salvation. And I think closing opposition is correct in their POI. If it is, and I'm going to further build that up even more, but if it believes that God put you into this position and that the whole goal of how your life has been structured is one that gets you straight into salvation, it is unclear why you believe that people are going to be courageous and brave enough to tamper with this plan and endure and not just, endure those harms because God believes that you're strong enough and as a result you can just, fight through it instead of fighting against it, which is fundamentally the comparative that Miri fails to engage with, which is one where you feel that you have agency, where you feel like you have the power to change the world around you, and as a result, you are far more plausibly going to act against that. Note, spectrum, right? Some people are going to fight against that, some people are not. And the either side of the house, some people are going to fight, some others won't. But crucially, we think that there's far more people who are going to act against that on our side of the house because they're far less likely to be complacent because they feel like they have some agency in that life. At the bottom line of this debate, the way you should adjudicate this is the following, right? The way that we believe you should adjudicate this. We're not God, right? No pun intended. I think that it should be the idea of, in your deathbed, are you likely to feel that you've had a life that has been enjoying, that you feel has been fulfilled, right? And we think that this is a life that we are far more able to give you in the opposition. And we give you reasons why. First of all, the amount of agency that they claim they have in proposition might exist, but they're in no way comparable to the amounts of agency that we are able to give you on our side of the house. On our side of the house, we quite literally tell you, you have agency, right? On their side of the house, they tell you, well, you can work within this spectrum, but you don't really have that much of a say insofar as by the end of it, the way, the place you're going to enter is hell or heaven, and this is predetermined based on what they've said already. Because the way they refute our line regarding homophobes is by saying, well, you as an individual will feel like these people might be Protestants, but at the same time, they might be Protestants that have a small seat reserved for them in hell. But this can also be true about the homophobes thinking that about you as a homosexual. And this is exactly where this becomes symmetrical and awash. As Prushemek tells you, as a response, Mir's response is not particularly helpful in the round. But also, number two, if you feel like your place in hell and heaven is reserved, as Mir says, then surely you feel that this is a situation which you, no matter whether or not you endure or fight against the system, you are not likely to change that, right? Whereas on our side of the house, you can change that and the afterlife becomes far more meaningful. You have to do good deeds in order to make it there. That is a far bigger incentive than the idea of, whatever. On our side of the house, we're able to tell you, you do this, you will end up in heaven. You don't do this, you will end up in hell. And this is, they might say, manipulation. But guess what? Manipulation is an inherent part of being religious, right? It will exist under either side of the house. You're able to be religious and you're going to be manipulated under either side of the house by the mere idea that you believe in a theory which quite literally tells you how you should live your life, or more importantly, what your afterlife is going to look like. Bearing that into consideration, manipulation is probably going to exist under other side of the house, and we've seen that already. Here's an incentive as to why the Protestants are going to manipulate people, because they want to disempower other religions. We saw that with the Reformation, and we saw that when they tried to take down the systems of economy in Europe back like some centuries ago. They do that all the time because their incentives a lot of the time can be political too, and they do happen exactly because of the fact that they have so much control over you. Now, why is it that this control is of far better quality on the opposition? And here's where we come in. Because we tell you that you might, for example, say no to something that you might feel that the universe, that God tells you to do, right? But at the same time, you have the option to actually go against that. And once you go against that, you can make up for it in the future. You can potentially make it to heaven anyways, because you have that agency, right? You can make mistakes because you have the agency. Whereas on their side of the house, you can't make mistakes because quite literally, there aren't mistakes to make. CG, I will take your POI.
Let's be clear. Certain people don't have agency because of structural factors. Religion makes them feel like they have agency, which they actually don't. Explain how these sorts of people get solace in the first place when they are told that their fate is as a result of their actions.
So basically your POI is poor people that are disenfranchised don't have much choice. As a result, we should tell them that they have no choice and no chance to get out of poverty. That's basically what you just told me in that POI. And quite literally, I'm not going to discuss that a bit further because Przemek has done all that already. And we've proven to you how it creates more of an incentive for people to do that. But number two panel, here's something. Even if they fail in their efforts to fight the system that disenfranchised them, we think that they're far better off, and it's far more fulfilling to feel like you've actually done something, like you've fought against that system, like you've had a chance, right? And even if you fail, you will blame on our side of the house someone else too. It's not like you're going to blame God necessarily, but which is on their side of the house. You can blame the system. You can blame things like, I don't know, not the accident of birth per se, but you can blame other individuals who are in power, who are elitist, and who have not given you the opportunity and disenfranchised you in the first place. These are different coping mechanisms that exist on either side of the house. I'm not particularly sure how they're able to change them. So in three core grounds, we beat OG. First, in guilt internalization, we tell you that we're better off dealing with it. Regarding agency, we explained to you why it's not particularly different under either side of the house, and pushing religious incentives is just better on their side, in our side of the house. On those grounds, we think that we're going through.
Great. I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech and call upon the member of government here.
Can you hear me? Cool. We think there are particular times where people envision and like look to God for particular answers, and we think that breaks the clash that's happening in opening half about about to what extent like you have agency over your own life and what extent you can make choices. And because we don't think OG really dealt with this, and what we're going to tell you is that the way in which you perceive God and the times at which you envision God isn't all the time, but rather in specific circumstances, which on the comparative is actually better off on our side of the house. We're going to provide reasoning that we think OG didn't give it to you, right? Three extensions then, right? Firstly, in terms of when you think of God. Secondly, in terms of why it's actually easier to break out on our side of the house rather than their side of the house. And thirdly, in terms of how you perceive people who are more successful and why that's particularly pernicious, right? A few rebuttals that don't fit it, right? Firstly, they say that like, look, like, you know, there's some poor people who feel like they want to like, who feel better when they feel like they're suffering and things like that, right? Understand this has actually been a really bad narrative in society, right? Mother Teresa literally got people into like hospitals to like let them die because she thought suffering was good for them, right? We don't think that people should ever think that suffering is good for them in that sense, right? We don't think they ever justify that argument to that extent, right? Secondly, in terms of they say that like, look, you envision, you see people who succeed, you see people who fail, and you're like, oh, I fail and my fate is like screwed, right? Understand that happens on either side of the house, right? But on our side of the house, it's even worse because you feel like you have the choice, but you're never able to change that anyway, and you feel bad that you can't express that. You feel even worse that you can never make that choice. That's the comparative that they need to deal with in terms of the argument about failure and success that they never dealt with, right? Okay. Firstly, in terms of when do you think of God, right? We think that God is, we think the way that like you frame religion is often that the religion answers questions that cannot be answered, right? Religion gives you solutions when there are no answers in the material world, right? This is the most popular framing of religion across society, right? What is the importance of this, right? This means that you don't always envision God at all points in your life, right? So going beyond what OG just said in terms of like, oh, like it's not always, this is the reason why it's not always, because religion is there to answer certain solutions about questions that you had in your life that you otherwise could not resolve within the constraints of your own life, right? This means when you're at a point when you don't have solutions or at a crossroads in your particular life, we think at that point of time is when you start to think of God, right? Which means it answers opening opposition's idea that like, oh, look, we're always going to like think that like my life is screwed, and at all points of time, I'm never going to really take any choices, right? Which means that like, you only really envision God at those points of time when you don't have solutions in life. Often people do have solutions in life. Often people do make slightly harder choices and things like that. That's not true. But when you're at that crossroads, when you don't think you have solutions, and the framing of religion is the fact that God answers those particular questions that you could not have been answered, is when you could perceive God. So we think that largely answers a lot of questions in terms of like, oh, like, you know, like I'm just going to like live a shit life. I don't really care, right? Secondly, in terms of why it's easier to break out, right? Here we think it's crucial to understand that like not everyone in society is religious, right? We live in the 21st century. Religion is like not the predominant force that exists in society, which means that there are already forces outside society which operate for change that already exist for these communities which are marginalized, right? So we don't think necessarily that this is the exclusive mechanism for breakout. But secondly, in terms of this, we think that like on their side of the house, people are afraid. They're afraid of whether or not the choice to break out is right, because crucially, on neither side do you actually solve the structures of morality of how religion preaches to you, which means that often religions do tell you that like, look, these particular people are like moral, or these particular people are immoral, and things like that, and like, or like these particular structures of life are moral or immoral, and those things will continue to exist on both sides of the house. They don't change, right? So on at least on our side of the house, like other people can change it in terms of privileged people with, or like the people who are on the higher end of that particular imbalance can actually try to change that. But on their side of the house, they're afraid to change that because they don't know how their actions will influence. And moreover, religious rhetoric often convinces them that like actually it's a bad thing to do because their choices and their actions actually influence the way in which they actually change those things. So at that point, we think people are afraid to go ahead and commit that change in the first place because they don't know if that change is going to lead to good things or bad things. Whereas on our side of the house, that fear doesn't exist, which means that the privileged people within those community can push for change at the very least, or even people within those communities can push for change without fear, right? We think at that point of time, like we think we think like, you know, like it largely answers that. But moreover, like other communities exist to push which are outside of religion. We don't think that like that's somehow exclusive to that side, right? Okay, moreover, in terms of how you perceive people who are more successful, and that's bad, right? In religious societies, and specifically in religious societies, because this is where the debate takes place, we think that like you often think about people who are successful and think that the reason why they got successful is because they did some particular choices and they and went ahead. And we think this justifies a sort of hierarchy that kind of exists already in terms of if you couldn't take those actions in the first place, then the reason why you're wrong is because you are at fault, right? We think that's particularly problematic because on the comparative, we think those hierarchies would not exist, because at that point of time, you think that things are like, we think that when your fate is slightly more, when you frame the question of fate in a more predetermined sense, we think it's more likely that that like even within those privileged structures, people can question those things, right? Because understand that they never prove to you how those people within that context of like underprivileged actually change their scenario in status quo, right? They never gave you a mechanism for change on their side of the house as to actually like go ahead and influence their lives, because often these structures are very hard to change, right? We say external change is actually better in terms of those in the privilege questioning their own beliefs, outside the fear that their own choices and actions might lead to certain scary things. And at that point of time, we think those are the particular individuals who can actually influence these kinds of structures. This looks like pastors who are more liberal-minded, who come about and are actually able to influence the way that like that particular religion manifests itself. The reason for this is because they're not scared about how their particular faith in the world looks like, because they don't have the kind of like anxiety that looks like, right? Finally, a little bit of like mech on opening government in terms of like how like religion limits your agency. We think the important thing here is that the way that you perceive the divine and that it answers questions which are unanswerable is, I think, is particularly important for the way it limits your agency, the way it like induces anxiety in your life, right? Because the way that like these things operate, because you think that like God answers questions that is like unanswerable, and the value that you ascribe to the divine in your own head, we think it's impossible for you to actually determine whether or not the choices that you take is actually the right choice or the wrong choice. And at that point of time, you think your life is fraught with anxiety as to how you want to lead your life. But this is more important than what opening government said, because like they didn't explain to an extent the extent to which people like sort of ascribe value to the divine, and how the divine is something that answers the unanswerable, and as you cannot possibly know what exactly the divine wants to know at that point of time. We think that then leads to lives that are fraught with anxiety. Is a better mechanism than what OG gave you. Extremely proud to propose.
Great. I'd like to thank that speaker for the fine speech and call upon the member of opposition. Hear, hear.
What we're going to bring to you from closing opposition is two things. Number one, we're going to analyze the psychology of people and why therefore agency is the most important thing in this debate. And secondly, we will show you that even though it is quite hard to make a change in your life, most people are able to make significant changes that make their lives feel better, even though it doesn't mean they become a millionaire or their social status changes to a large extent. Before that, just two pieces of framing that I think are very important in this debate. Number one, the motion explicitly says this house prefers to follow a religion. So it's from the perspective of one individual. So I think that implies that the effects on you as an individual should be weighed significantly higher than the society-wide effects that opening half is to a large extent talking about, because we think that it's super uncertain that you as one individual have a large effect on a wider society as a whole, and therefore all the society-wide effects are super uncertain, and you should prefer the individual effects because they are certain. Second thing, government says in both, because we think that CG was quite derivative, we think that both government teams say something along the lines of most people have no or a low option to change, and therefore they need to have the solace from the religion telling you that it's not your fault that you're in the current position. The opposition on the opening opposition on this says that people can change this and they can get to better circumstances. What we want to add here is two things. Number one, by looking at the individuals, by looking at the psychology of the individual, we're showing to you that even if it's true that most people cannot change their circumstances to a large extent, they can change them to such an extent that it makes their lives better. But secondly, even if people even if it's true that most people cannot change it, it still doesn't matter for them. Trying alone makes them feel better. And since we have a lot of evolutionary biases, it also leads to us being happy independent of the circumstances. Now, let's go into the two pieces of analysis that I want to give. I'll take you after this, after the first argument. Okay, so to the first piece of analysis, which is on the psychology of the human, where opening opposition, we noticed you already said that they said the word agency, but they didn't provide any reasons or more detailed analysis as to why this changes your behavior or your perception of the world in a specific way. So reason number one, we think that having no feeling of control it makes you feel extremely powerless, and that feels terrible. We think the reason for this is that humans have a desire to change their surroundings, and this is a very strong evolutionary drive that we have. Just our ancestors, for our ancestors, it was terribly reasonable to change their circumstances if they were bad. If there was a food shortage, you had to go out and get food, etc., etc. If there were bad circumstances around you, you would have to change them. Therefore, all the people that change stuff were significantly more likely to survive, and therefore this is a huge desire that we have. That means if there's a conflict between what your God or your church tells you and your human desires, then this makes you feel extremely bad because there's a strong tension between those things. I think we can see that agency is something super important alone by looking at cases of sexual assault or oppressive states, where just the feeling of having loss of agency is more terrible than most other things that could happen to you in life. So agency is super important to people. That's number one. Number two, people have an optimism bias. That means people are hopeful. They think the future is better than now if they make changes to them, even in the absence of evidence. So statistically, most people do not would not become more rich in the future, or statistically, most people are not going to climb up the social ladder. However, most people still think that they will be richer in the future and the future will be better. Therefore, we think that they kind of have a feeling of that their current circumstances are only temporary and the future will be better. And this sliver of hope is a very strong driver in most people. So as long as there is no God telling you cannot change your circumstances, and it's completely, or I determine whatever your circumstances are, most people are likely to act even though it is not true that they can change their surroundings in a super strong way. So people are super biased in this particular way. Lastly, I think for most people, just looking at all of us, just trying is already a good feeling in and of itself. So, for example, for most people who are coming to the Olympics, it's completely irrational to run against Usain Bolt because they know they're not going to win against him. Even still, most people are trying, and afterwards they don't feel like super shit that they didn't win, but rather they feel good for having tried. Trying alone is already something that is important. Note that on the government side of the house, they would have to defend most people not trying because they believe that God makes their future, and therefore losing all of these benefits and directly contradiction human psychology. Opening government, Tim, please.
Though you still have to strive to be moral to get to heaven, on your side of the house, people consistently look around themselves for proof of punishment, which causes strong feelings of fear and anxiety. Because on opposition side, people still have to follow a predetermined set of rules, rewards, and punishments. They never have any real agency on opposition as well. What we do, at least, is make decisions easier.
So no. I'm just saying, even like most people do not search for punishment. Most people just think that the future is going to be better. That's it. Okay, now this leads to a better life for you if you try. So first reason for this, social mobility might not be perfect, but it still exists to some degree. That means that just climbing, like, it doesn't mean you're likely to become a millionaire, but if you work harder because you think that you have agency over yourself, it just means that you might be a little bit richer, you might be a little bit more able to buy your children education, etc., etc. Therefore, your children have a better future, which probably also is something positive for you. Second thing, there's also other parts of life that doesn't have to do anything with you earning a lot of money that can change a lot, that are part of the material world, part of the things that you think you can change. That means family and friendships. For example, if you have a bad time with your partner, instead of thinking that it was God who punished you, you think it might have been your fault. You should change something in your behavior such that the relationship gets better. Same with bad mental states, depression, etc., etc. I think you're significantly more likely to go to therapy if you think that this is not a punishment, but rather something that you can change by working harder with your therapist, by actually doing something. Therefore, your life will become better, even in these smaller things. Note that most of these things, even if you're poor, are still something that influence your life significantly. Having good relationships, having good mental health is something that is terribly important, therefore should be weighed really highly in this way. Lastly, also on larger society, if you think you have an effect, you're more likely to take a vote seriously, you're more likely to go to demonstration, go to demonstrations, you're more likely to work in the community. That also falls back on you as a person because it changes your surroundings in a positive way.
Great. I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech and call upon the government whip to close the government side. Here.
Can you guys hear me? All right, I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. It's immensely patronizing for the opposition bench to assume that these people have not already tried to change their fate. The problem is when there's so many structural barriers, we don't see the utility in just trying, because they never show how just trying on their side of the house, which we think people do anyway, is going to have any sufficient contribution towards actually changing the way they feel and the way they can achieve those sorts of structural barriers, right? So Hartz already tells you that like there's structures outside religion which allow you to reach these things in the first place, but through campaigning which happens outside religion, right? But at the point at which you keep trying, knowing that there are too many structural barriers, we think individuals start blaming themselves for their inability to override them, seeing other people and making constant comparisons with them as to how they've been able to get over their struggles. We think what we can prove here is like closing opposition's world is definitely one way individuals have issues about their own perception and tie it to their own inability to challenge their circumstances and to challenge the way that their world exists, right? We think for these people in particular, it's important to give them hope, right? Because understand that the world they live in is not the final manifestation of their fate. We think it's better that they leave it up to God with the idea that maybe God can help me out, maybe God knows what's happening and can make something out of this. It's immensely patronizing for even opening to say things like people like say that, yeah, I am poor out of choice. We think that's ridiculous. We think leaving people to die for your own religious motives is particularly problematic, right? But then they say you can change to some extent. We don't understand what this change particularly is, right? We think when you can rally around activists who aren't afraid to help you because they're not tying what they're doing directly to religious dogma, we think that's a world which is better to live in, right? Then they talk about things like you are more likely to go to therapy. We think when mental illnesses are anyway treated as a dogma by most facets of religion, you're less likely to actually expose that you have these problems in the first place. Notice that a lot of the problems are exclusively come out to you from closing government. Things like you having familial problems, which like religion shuns in the first place. Things like you having mental health issues, which religion doesn't want you to talk about. All these problems get solved only when you're not making calculations with respect to how your religion will perceive you doing such a thing. On all those ways, we think we have beaten closing opposition, right? Moving on to opening opposition, what really is the case that they give us, right? We think they say that people who feel unsatisfied get more motivation, right? We think people who feel unsatisfied by the virtue of their material surroundings are already likely to do something anyway. At the point at which they are making comparisons with those who are just more fortunate to be in those circumstances, we think there's always a feeling that what they're doing isn't enough, although we don't think there's a construction that helps their mental health in any way, right? Then they say that like it's hard to accept God's plan because you want a motivation to change your life, which is when they start talking about things like, you chose suffering and that's helpful. We don't think the framing that you chose suffering in any way helps the perception of these communities or how they feel in terms of their orientation towards achieving change in the first place. When the rest of the world is content in believing that they chose suffering, we think it's an immensely problematic world to live in. We would rather that they have a belief that what they're in right now is subject to change and can change given that God is likely to help them. God is likely to stand for them whenever they make these decisions in the first place. Understand that like the sort of world they set in is one where you're constantly dictated by God and God's mandates, right? I'll take opening in a little bit. But like the point that we make significantly is you trust God in those times when you don't have solutions. We think it's not true that you won't seek out solutions at all. It's in those instances where you're unsure of what to do that you consult God. At that point in time, should that belief in God and the things you derive from God make you feel worse about yourself and your material surroundings? Or should you feel that at that point, God is giving you answers which motivate you to doing something better with your life, to feeling better even if you can't materially change the way that your life has shaped up, right? Then they say like there's no celebration of success. We think it's better on the comparative. The comparative is, we think a world where people are humble about their success and not condemnatory towards people who have failed materially is a healthier world to live in, because on that world, you're more likely to help out those who aren't as privileged as you. We think opening opposition never really deals with how the illusion of more agency is actually likely to help out these sorts of people solve their material problems. Before I proceed, opening.
Okay. Your extension / knife is about why religion is good in general. Are you more likely to stick with a religion and engage with it if you feel it can offer you something unique in your current life that can actually change something, and that not everything is predetermined? Or are you more likely to just stop engaging with it as much?
Let's be clear, right? If you're talking about the outcomes you can achieve, we think there are other structures whom you can rely on. But specifically talking about the value that religion has to individuals, particularly when they don't see material answers to their problems, we think it's better than a religion gives them these sorts of intuitions that maybe this is like, maybe things are going to get better for you. Maybe there's like a better plan for you. We think on your side, you remove that hope when you say it's down to your actions. You can't really change anything about it, right? But where does our extension truly come into this debate, right? Firstly, we think we make it clear when these perceptions, when these connections to God are important. We say at the point where you like are trying to break out of these sorts of barriers, when you're asking for solutions, that's when that's when your belief in God and your questioning of God truly comes in. The framing that God gives you answers to unsolvable problems in your life is where we think like opening half misses out in characterizing what is the extent that individuals truly rely on religion, right? Secondly, when we talk about breaking out in terms of like structures and actually getting change, we're the only side that gives you two specific mechanisms to do this, right? Firstly, we tell you that when there's a social dynamic created between those that are privileged and those that are not, right? We don't want the privileged to constantly evaluate whether what they're doing is in line with God's mandate. So Huss talks to you about liberal pastors who are unwilling to challenge the head pastor who is more conservative. We're also talking about people in privilege who understand their privilege but yet feel like going against what God has given them might be a-religious or a-scriptural, right? And we get crucial support from these sorts of people. But more importantly, from communities themselves, in terms of minorities themselves and how they feel, we think we give you analysis in particular about the comparison to religion when you're making change, when you're deciding to break out of a bad marriage, when you're deciding to rise against the state, is something which you're more likely to do because you're not constantly weighing that out against how God judges you, because people think that God is more likely to support you regardless of what you do. That's a far better world to live in, right? We think opening is quite glib on certain responses, right? When they talk about like why people are more likely to help other individuals, they say that because you have a broad belief that God created everyone equal, right? Most significantly, we think that when individuals do have an imperative and do have a feeling within them that I must help these individuals, we think when they compare themselves to what God would want them to do, mostly it turns out that they follow the conservative route. Mostly they stick to the scriptural route, which means that you discriminate against minorities, which means that you lock people into conservative structures. On our side of the house, those particular people, and there's more significant than opening government, mean that like there's a real reason why you get actual help. It's not just about your notional belief in God. On our side of the house, we give these poor people answers to questions which the material world can't answer. Extremely proud to propose.
Great. I would like to thank that speaker for the fine speech and call upon the opposition whip to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
Panel, we think there's 4 important clashes in this debate. I'll be going through both government teams in my rebuttal, addressing most of them, and then crucially showing the specific contribution that Marius made and why it wins the remaining clashes. We think these questions are, do people need agency, and how much agency do they have on each side, and how much does that compel them to strive for a better life, firstly? Secondly, are people going to be happy with the specific and respective circumstances that they end up in life with? Thirdly, do people still fight for justice? And fourthly, sort of like, how does that overall create a specific societal structure, and is that good or bad? Let's start with opening government, and some of this is going to also specifically going to address closing governments because they repeated quite a lot misconceptions here. Okay, first of all, some of the things that we hear continuously throughout opening government is this question of like, how nice or mean are people going to be in their personal lives? Like, are homophobes going to be going around being homophobic to people, or are we going to be quite nice? And this is completely outside of the debate. Let's be very specific. Getting to heaven or hell is something that on both sides of the debate is contingent on the morality of my behavior. This motion is about my material fate in the material world, not the moral judgment of God that then ends up with me going to heaven or hell. So the result of this is moral commandments exist in the same strength on both sides, and people have the same incentives to adhere to them or not adhere to them. This is irrelevant. Okay, second question is like this continuous idea that people will feel like their current specific like material circumstances, if they are bad, are a sign that God is angry with me, or that this is a punishment from God. We think this also is something that is outside of the debate and neither side has to defend. because either like my material circumstances are predetermined by God and they are like not connected to my specific actions on the ground, since God doesn't like reevaluate like my material, like my moral worth, and then adjusts my fate on government side. And on opposition side, my material fate is disconnected from a judgment of God, and as a result, I will also not perceive my current circumstances as like God being angry with me. So we think this also falls out of the debate. The third question, and this like ties into the justice clash, and this doesn't tie into the justice clash, is like how motivated are people going to be to like still strive for a better life? And here, for example, like Miri tells us is like, oh, people still need jobs, people still like need to do stuff. And we think like this is a bit unfair. Like obviously, if you think that your current position in life is the preordained idea of what God believes like is fit for you, then you're not going to try as hard to change it. Like, yes, you're going to get a job, but you're not going to try to like meaningfully improve the broader trajectory of your life. You're not trying to get a much better job. You're not trying to get to like improve significantly. Okay. Lastly, this idea that like you're more likely to fight for justice if you believe that God is on your side, because ultimately you're going to win the fight. And this is something we also hear from both government teams. We think this again is outside of the debate, because the belief that either like my beliefs are correct because they're from God, this happens on both sides. That's the basis of religion. But secondly, the idea of sort of like divine intervention, of God aiding me in an effort if I undertake it, that's also something that's not really represented by either side. Like divine intervention may happen on either side. What we're asking here is stuff predetermined, or is it up to my own devices? Not like, does God intervene at some point? Okay. So, secondly, let's go into two specific points from closing government. The rest of opening government will be specifically addressed in the constructive from Marius. So the two other things that closing government tells us is that like the weird framing that religion only answers sort of like specific questions. I only invoke God in times of dire need when I have questions that can't be answered. And that's a direct knife to opening government, who clearly says that religion has a very tight grasp on me and like dictates a large part of my life. But this is also like the base fact that religions claim moral authority over the entirety of your life and don't just say like, oh, look, ask God in times of dire straits. Like we think this is a kind of behavior that casually religious people might do, but not the kind of like real believers that are the most affected from this debate. I'll take opening now.
Right. On your side of the house, your agency is still limited because you can't really influence everything that is going on around you. However, that actions and choices influence the consequences, aka that whatever happens to you shows how God feels about you, is literally the wording of the burden you have to defend for the Infos life.
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about agency. Because both of the government teams tell us that ultimately most people live in circumstances where they have no agency, so them believing that they have it is like a recipe for disaster. And Marius gave you specific reasons, for why people really need the belief in agency. Irrespective of what happens to your circumstances, you need to feel like you have agency, because this is like a very basic desire in life. And if you do not feel like you can affect your circumstances, this in itself makes you unhappy. So this is a damn like already a hard. But secondly, we gave you reasons for why it's actually quite likely that you can affect your material circumstances. So like even if structural oppression exists, social mobility still is there. Like it's harder, but people are still going to make it out of poverty to some extent, like sure at lower rates, but this still happens. The second thing that Marius told you is you can improve your life in a variety of different ways that are not specifically like tied to your bank account. Like you can work on your mental health. You can work on fostering like a helpful, supportive friend group. There's a number of ways that you aren't oppressed in achieving, that you can actually have meaningful agency and strive for a better life. But lastly, what we want to say is in many ways, structural inequalities are the result of the discouragement of poverty, that people don't try as hard in life because they feel bad by their surroundings, that people are unlikely to apply to jobs at the same rates, that people are unlikely to try as hard in school because they believe in this sort of determinism that they're not going to make it out anyway. So we think under our side, people get further in life anyway. And why is that so important? Because we don't think government can get away with claiming that you can make every kind of life meaningful as long as you think it is preordained. We think there's a lot of aspects of poverty that are simply immutably bad and immutably hurt you. This is having bad health. This is being hungry. This is suffering from violence continuously. This is knowing that you cannot provide a good life for your children. We think these things sting and they make you suffer irrespective of your belief in whatever divine shit is going on. Under our side, less people have to suffer this. Under our side, people feel agency, they feel empowered, and everyone feels a little better off. Please oppose.
Great. I'd like to thank the speaker for the fine speech and thank everybody for what was a fantastic debate. So we will go and judge now if you would like to leave this room, and we will get back to the results later. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm guessing the streaming will also leave, right?
I hope so. Otherwise,
Yeah,
I'll write the
that'd be
perfect.
pretty good.